So when covering MMORPGs, I typically just want to know enough to decide, am I going to play it or am I not going to play it? And as soon as I know I'm not going to play it, I can move on. And as soon as I know I am, I don't really want anything spoiled, because one of my favorite things in an MMORPG is the surprise and the discovery and all the things that happen when you get into things you've never done before. And you're experiencing things that you just didn't know would happen. Ashes of Creation is a game that has been on the horizon for quite some time. It's going to be on the horizon for quite some time still. And so I've already decided I want to play it. And so typically that would mean just wait. Maybe I need to decide whether or not I want to pre-order it, but that's it. I've decided that I want to play it, and that's enough. However, Ashes of Creation, for some reason, has shown that they're willing to communicate a lot. And most MMORPGs are not willing to communicate this much prior to launch, while showing actual gameplay, while taking feedback and adjusting. In a previous video about this, I referenced 111 nodes because that was a thing they tried. And I've been told, actually, that's already down to 85. Like, it's been an immense amount of information, and it's a moving target, because all it takes to move something in Ashes is for Steven and his team to say that it moved, as opposed to an existing MMORPG where you would actually have to go in and change things. You would actually have to go in and rebuild it. And so with Ashes, all Steven has to do to change it from tab target to action camera is just say that. You could just say that, and then it's changed. Now, they have backed that up by some test gameplay, but test gameplay is just that. Beta and alpha gameplay is oftentimes something that can change drastically between that point and when something is actually released. And so if they say there's a loot system and they show it off in a beta build, and then they say it's a different loot system, then it's different. It's different. Just like that. Snap of a fingers, it's totally different. Internally, they may have a lot of work to go through for those changes, but us as the people that are just receiving the information, it would be an overnight change in one of his announcements to come out and say something that drastically went. For example, backing up and saying, you know what, the constant PvP, we've decided we're going to do war mode, and we're going to have that be toggleable PvP. If he said that, it would be a massive change, and it would be, as soon as he said those words, we would know it's different. But I'm trying to get to know it. So as I want to get to know this name, I've been watching more and more content. I really enjoy Narc, makes it very entertaining to consume. And I'm getting to know this game a lot more. And the reason I picked this game to be the one that I want to cover as it comes out is I want to get better at being able to cover games before they come out. And B, I think this one shows real promise. I think there's a lot I'm excited about what this game is doing. They're making some really bold statements. They're making some very, very bold statements. And I think we have a long time between now and launch that we'll get to cover kind of that journey and get used to it. So it'll be hard for me to know exactly how I feel about this at any given time, because I'm always going to want to compare it to the concrete examples of real existing games. And that is kind of unfair to Ashes because they haven't been given a chance to show what they can do, but it's also kind of unfair to the existing games because all Ashes has to do to be better than them is say it's better than them. A huge number of people have come into streams and YouTube comments across Gaming Kinda or Work to Game, the streams over on Twitch at Work to Game, and they pointed out as some example. There's something I do or I don't like about what a particular MMORPG is doing, and we're discussing that. And they say, well, Ashes is going to do it better. That's just words. Like, it's really easy to say you're going to be better if you just have to say you're going to be better and that's it. You don't have to back it up by actually releasing something that really moves an element of the game forward. So, on that note, solution to a dynamic open world. I've heard different terms used. I took issue with the word procedural. I don't think it's procedural, but a dynamic open world. How do you solve that? What exactly makes a world dynamic, and how do you keep it feeling dynamic? Because players will always optimize. So what do you do to keep people from feeling like they have now managed to hone the world down to something that, while it may have started out dynamic, eventually becomes very static?
It appears I could only milk this month's live stream for 2 videos this time, so I thought to myself, I'm f***ed. but we can at least make them bangers, considering we're beginning to touch on my favorite systems in MMORPGs, the artisan skills, and I have a sneaky suspicion this month's livestream will continue this trend. However, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Such baseless claims require finesse, so I shall wait until Stephen finally replies to my barrage of DMs before teasing you further. A virtual ecology is a complicated and incredible feat to pull off in an MMORPG, and across history, it has only been attempted properly once by a game many of you probably haven't even played: Ultima Online. A game that can only be labelled as the grandfather of MMORPGs, and one that should be respected, for it paved the way for many systems that are regularly used today, but also showed us that some systems are almost impossible to pull off.
Ultima Online is one that's regularly referenced as kind of one of the building grounds for people like Naoki Yoshida, Yoshi P, that is in charge of Final Fantasy XIV. Sometimes a game has a large impact on an industry, not because we, the players, have played it. I never got to play Ultima, but because the people who make the games we play now, and the people who give the feedback we give now, came from that game. When I play games like RimWorld and stuff like that, those have had an outsized impact from a game called Dwarf Fortress, coming to Steam December 6th. Dwarf Fortress has been around a long time. The total number of players that have ever played Dwarf Fortress for any substantial amount of time, or possibly even heard of it, is very small, for the fact that there's an entire genre of game that owes a great debt of gratitude to those that it has impacted. It's done an immense amount. It just had a UI and a learning curve that made it very hard to be widely appealing. But it's an incredible game once you overcome those things. Ultima Online is one of those games. When you talk about Ultima Online and EverQuest and a lot of these games that, you know, maybe they're around in some state, maybe they're not, they have become kind of a founding member of what we do today and where we evolved from. The basis of the systems we have today, even if those systems have been iterated on to the point where they look nothing like they did when they were being used at that time, because of things like limitations to internet activity access, or how much hardware there could be on a server side or client side, or what the size of the community that was available, the amount of time, money, resources that was there. When we look back at these games, the quality and quantity of voice acting and story writers and mechanics designers and playtesting has all grown unbelievable. The amount of money that can be put into a game now to be put on hardware that's available now is incredible. So some of these systems have just changed as the times have updated. Others have changed because they've continually tried to refine out what they saw as the weakness and build on what they saw as the strength.
Mainly because the players who autistically play MMORPGs are batshit insane. However, it seems Stephen Sharif has taken up the challenge to attempt this once again, building off the mistakes Ultima Online made by attempting to create a living, breathing ecology. And I'm excited to discuss this with you all today. But before we get into that, our patrons and I would love for you to grab yourself a Coca-Cola, because this is most certainly a controversial system, but a system that, if pulled off correctly, can truly deliver a living, breathing world unlike any MMO we've had the pleasure of playing before. That is, granted we actually get to play this bastard thing. And today we'll be touching on what an ecology system is, the problems Ultima Online had with it, and the solutions that Intrepid are putting in place to ensure its success.
I will say, when it comes to Ashes, the reason that I want to start talking about this game more is I do think it's going to release. When we first started hearing about it, you didn't know, but I think there are other games, you know, I got asked over and over if I was going to play some of these other games that have come and gone, and I never made time for them, and they never sold me on whether or not they'd actually make it. Not that every game I've ever invested my time in has turned out to be amazing, and not that every game has to be. If you can have fun for it while it lasts, there are a lot of people that have very fond memories of games like WildStar. It's not around anymore, but those memories are yours, and that's awesome. I I do think Ashes is going to come out, and I think it's going to be commercially successful on launch. I have no idea what post-launch looks like. That's something that's very hard to navigate for MMOs, because what ends up happening is MMO players come in and they tear through all the content that it offers, and then there's not more ready right away because they're too busy. They just got through a huge sprint. Now they've got to do any bug fixes, all the things they could have never anticipated the players doing. And they're expected to do more. They're expected to add more dungeons or more modes or expansions on the map or whatever very, very quickly. It's very hard for a new MMO to do very well out of the gate. And Narc has poked fun at games like New World for not having enough endgame on launch, but Ashes is very likely going to have the same problem.
Ultima Online had with it, and the solutions that Intrepid are putting in place to ensure its success. Now, with all that bollocks out of the way, let's begin, shall we? So, to begin with, like anything mentioned in a live stream, there is always a subset of brainlets crying out, "Scope creep," and that's okay. It is hard to keep track of every single system Ashes of Creation is attempting to pull off, so if something does sound new, it's almost certainly just an obscure system that hasn't been mentioned for many, many months. You can't expect everyone to be autistically invested in every single aspect of it.
Things also sound bigger as you start to hear details. It's very easy. We're all aware of times in our life when you thought you would just do something in a game or whatever, and you thought, real quick, I'm just gonna do this. This week I thought, I've got a couple minutes, I'm gonna tidy up the kitchen. I was gonna do it after work, but we were on one of these lovely Twitch ad breaks, and I thought, let me go ahead and just put away the clean dishes in the rack by the sink. And as I did, we had made popcorn this weekend, and we make our popcorn on the stove because we don't have a microwave for reasons, whatever. And so we had the popcorn bag sitting right there, and I thought, let me just go put that in the pantry. And I picked it up, I ran my finger across the top of the kernel bag to seal it, I heard it seal, and then I lifted it into the shelf, and sure enough, it wasn't sealed all the way. It bent over and it dumped kernels everywhere. So now this simple 1 to 2 minute task that I thought I had time for has created a mess that will now take me substantially longer than 2 to 3 minutes to clean up. It has turned into a larger task. So some of this scope creep that he's saying, well, maybe there was a feature that was always there. When they say something very early on in a game, like, what is it going to have? And you say something like, it'll have engaging lore. Okay, well, what else will it have? It'll have a combat, and you just move on. But as we get closer and closer, and as they're able to do things like show us, this kind of beta level of gameplay and this alpha state, whatever words you want to use, isn't Fortnite still in beta? And so as they show us the beginnings of actual content hitting, you start to learn what these words are. What is engaging story, right? What is this lore that you're building on? And all of a sudden you start to realize, oh, that's a big task. So some of it is also just that feeling of when you're chewing something you've been chewing for too long and it feels like it's growing in size in your mouth. And you're like, I don't like this food, but I should have just eaten it or not eaten it. It has gotten worse because this is just going to grow and grow and grow as you start to realize, to satisfy all people's definition of engaging lore, lore itself is a huge issue. Loot systems itself is a huge issue. Crafting and gathering is a huge issue. And so each of these things can just expand into being an enormous system. Sometimes it's not. There are games where it is very, very simple. Crafting and gathering in World of Warcraft is very, very, very simple. Crafting and gathering in Final Fantasy is a huge system that you could spend hundreds, if not thousands of hours diving into while not going out and killing anything. And so saying we're going to add a crafting and gathering system, what does that mean? And as they start to define more and more, it does sound like scope creep. And that's because it is new information. In some cases, he might be right. Maybe we just didn't know they said it years ago. Somebody like me that really didn't listen to the initial rumblings of there's another MMO on the horizon, but now is trying to get involved and become aware and become knowledgeable on this game and start to learn all of this. It's all new to me. But I think there's also a very real chance that some of it is just the natural growth as we start to get more and more and more details. And it's no longer just here's the 5 ideas that define the game, or here's the 10 types of content that's going to be in the game. And we start to get into the here are the 35 abilities that make up this class.
This overly ambitious MMO now, can we? If we did, then I'd be out of a job, and where would you be then? Oh yeah, probably not giving a shit about this game that quite literally doesn't exist. However, I can assure you, just like the weather and seasonal systems, this ecology mechanic has been planned since the very beginning, hearing hints of it all the way back in 2017. So what is an ecology system then? Well, in layman's terms, it's quite literally a dynamic world with flora and fauna that adapt depending on player behavior. The only successful and modern MMO that actually attempts anything like this is Guild Wars 2. However, theirs is very focused on pushing the player through a story narrative and rewarding you for doing so in a very binary manner. Nothing quite like an ecology system at all. On top of that, it is also very on rails. You can easily predict when things are happening, and the gameplay itself is very one-dimensional. You go to an area, do what the quest marker says, and then you're rewarded for completing that event. Very, very basic, very, very theme park-esque.
There's a little more to it than that. So Guild Wars 2 has a couple of different things. First of all, the narrative one that he's describing most clearly is very much like he's saying. When you go through the story, you get to choose when to do it. You can stop and start whenever you want. You can start wherever you want inside the video game. Ultimately, that story has a beginning and a middle and an end, like many MMORPG stories do. They don't end up with 17 different Bandersnatch style choose your own adventure endings. They're not Divinity. They're not a D&D simulator. And that is because the final fight is usually an epic boss night. And if you have this epic boss, like if your epic boss is at the end, you get to fight Narc. We all have to fight Narc in the end. And so you can maybe write it so that some of us fight him to help him become the god that you think he is of Ashes of Creation content. Or maybe you fight him because you don't like the way he makes voices and you think he makes fun of the way you play games. But ultimately, in the end, we need to be able to party up to beat him. So all of us have to have a story ending that ends in a battle with Narc. And all of us, that battle will end the same way. You get him down to 1% and he runs off to fight again another day, or you kill him now and he's done forever. And so there are these moments where it recollapses down and we're all in the same spot, but along the way, where you're in these little individual story moments, you may get to choose between a left, middle, and right door. You may have unique dialogue options. You may have unique dialogue responses. And those are based on what class you play, what race you play, what dialogues you chose, who you're aligned with. Various things cause there to be replayability, not to mention there's a number of achievements that cause you to go back and play through and says, hey, next time try saving all the villagers from the fire, or don't save any of them from the fire. And so there are different achievements that cause you to have replayability in the narrative in a way that for any other game to do, it probably doesn't have that much lore in its narrative. So for the fact that that is underpinned by an entirely voice-acted story, with very rare exception, is incredible. It's nothing short of incredible. Your own character has a voice. That's just the story. Now, when you get out into the open world, there are things called events. And the large ones are called meta events. And so if I go out to my browser and I say Guild Wars event timer, on the wiki, there is an event timer right here. And these are all the events going on in the different expansions and things like that. And these are absolutely timed. They will start at that time. Whether or not there's enough people around to complete them is up for it. Whether or not that event has variations to it is there. That is absolutely going on. There are also events that are player triggered. The actions that we take cause these. Even within the various quests and events that are in the zone, it is possible that multiple things you do contribute. Maybe there's a farmer that's really struggling to gain control of their farm because of a recent wave of whatever evil that came into the area. And so maybe they need help burning any of their evil plants so it doesn't infest the rest of their plants. Maybe they need you to fight off the evil demons that have invaded their farm, or maybe they need you to go around and harvest some of their crops because they haven't had time to do so. And any of those things you do will move the event forward by varying amounts. And so go to the area, do the thing is very much like go to the quest giver, get 10 bear butts, turn it in, quest complete. But actually Guild Wars has a fair bit of I don't seem to really be able to find any of the infested plants. Well, who cares? Then kill the demons. Or I don't actually enjoy killing demons. Well, then who cares? Go and harvest the clean crops. So it starts to be a lot more choice than most games offer. So I just want to kind of note some of that emergent behavior, or whatever you want to call it, where players go into an area and help either trigger it into future events, or come here to do various timed events, or are progressing the quests in the area through a variety of ways, or are going through the story in a variety of ways. Like, there's actually a surprising amount of variety, but all of that variety is pre-programmed. All of that variety is within the spectrum of what the devs foresaw. They didn't create, well, what if I want to help him build his fences back? That's not an option, because the devs didn't make that an option. So what it does not do is something that is very close to what like a game of D&D would do, where my brother, who is our dungeon master when we play D&D, would say something like, what do you want to do next? And he would have planned, we're going to enter the cave and we're going to fight the guy. We're going to enter the cave and we're going to talk to the guy. Or we're going to run out of the cave towards the field. And we say, we're going to lie outside the cave and ambush. And he has to go, okay, I guess roll for whatever. And then he has to make up a series of events because we took him in a direction that no matter how much prep he did for the week, he had not predetermined was an option. And yet, because of the kind of dungeon master he is, he's not going to say that's not a choice. He will make that happen. But a video game cannot do that. So I'm interested to see how an MMORPG, a shared space on a server, a very real server programmed by very real devs to be released to very real players, I'm interested to see how you get beyond what Guild Wars offers if the other end of the spectrum starts to get into something that I have to mention D&D because I don't know of a video game that can do that on a massively multiplayer, perpetually online scale.
The way Ashes of Creation differs is very sandbox in nature, rather than a basic theme park delivery like a world quest or randomly spawning event. When the dynamic of the world changes in Vera, it not only drastically changes the content available, like the mob types, access to certain caves and locations, but it also drastically changes the economy as certain materials in demand fall out of season and become extremely scarce, maybe even in some cases becoming not available at all. We've preached many times on the channel about the importance of economy in an MMORPG, and by layering a sandbox-focused MMO with a virtual ecology, I think we'll be seeing results no other MMORPG has been able to pull off before, provided Ashes of Creation can actually pull it off. So then let's shift the conversation over to the one MMO that truly attempted this and
So before we shift where he's talking about where he's seen this before, I would say that's not truly any more dynamic in Guild Wars in that it is still a predetermined number of outcomes. So if there are 4 seasons in a year and each area has a total of 12 caves that mix and match across those seasons. Maybe it's available in the 2 wet seasons, but not the 2 dry seasons, or the other way around. Then you already can filter into there are 12 caves, and those caves are available. And each of those caves are populated by each of the 4 seasonal types of creatures. If various events are done in the area, it breaks those apart. So if there are a lot of trees in the area, then there are a lot of, I don't know, tree elves that you have to kill. And if all the trees have been chopped down, then there are a lot of plains lions. I don't care. And so you end up with still a finite number of possibilities. It's not going to be any more endless than something like Guild Wars because it all still has to be pre-built. The only way you get away from that is if you, since I've mentioned Dwarf Fortress, move to something like Dwarf Fortress where you don't have to pre-test these things. There are forgotten beasts in that game that can come attack you that are just amalgamations of things because that game doesn't have to render them. It's a top-down game and it's meant to be played in ASCII as its original form. So if it's a dragon, it's just a capital letter D. It can be a dragon that has insert X number of legs with X number of heads made of the following type of scales. And it has the following modifiers. It has a tail of poisoned and it vomits fire while belching smoke, while having horns coming out of its wings. And it can start to put these words together where, like, there's whole little subreddits of where people try to draw the forgotten beast that's put out in the descriptor, because the descriptor's so random, you're like, that doesn't even make sense. And it walks on its 2 hands with its 6 legs in the air. And you're like, what are you telling me? Because all it has to do is say the capital letter D. And so it can be wildly dynamic to a degree where there's no way that the dev could have foreseen everything, because Zach and Tarn didn't have to test it. They didn't have to worry about it, because there's not anything, there's no art that has to go with that. There's no balance that has to go with that. There's not really like a designated loot table per se that has to be put there because we need everybody to have access to a certain item level of gear in an area. So it's not bound by any of the rules that MMORPGs share. What it can do, however, is it can create an immense amount of variety. There are reasons in Guild Wars 2, since that's the game that Narc brought up, to go back and be in zones that you have not been into for a very long time because you need them for something. Maybe you're going back into these zones because this particular meta event is up, and because it's up, that gives you access to a resource that is needed for crafting an item that you weren't trying to craft 6 months ago. And so and because you haven't done that meta in a long time, or because maybe in this case that meta functions a little differently during a certain season, that can start to feel like that variety. And so you see this in even if you just back up in World of Warcraft's history, when you run dungeons that have rare bosses that can be up, or when you walk into an arena inside a dungeon, it has 6 or 7 different bosses it can spawn. And so every time you run it, it's one of the 6 possible outcomes. But there is no 7th outcome. It's one of the 6. So I do admire that they are trying to say, screw 6, let's make it 36 different things you can do in this area. But ultimately, what that will feel like long term is people who are used to doing world quests in World of Warcraft may not repeat the same world quest for many days on end. People who do hunt trains in Final Fantasy XIV may not kill the exact combination of hunts for many days in a row on end. People in Guild Wars that do a certain set of metas when they get off work may not do the exact same meta, or metas that have multiple choices may not have the same outcome for many days on end. But the activity itself starts to feel very No Man's Sky, where when you started out, it looked like an infinite number of possibilities, but by the 4th or 5th or 6th possibility, you're like, oh, there's tree elves over here, and then there's rock elves over here. But effectively, the quest is just kill 10 elves, and I'm just doing it in a different scene change. So, like, I appreciate it, but that's something that New World does. Go out in an area and kill a bear, go to a different area and kill a bear. It's, go into an area with skeletons and steal their chests, or go into a different area with skeletons and kill the skeletons. After a certain amount of gameplay, you start to have enough things in common between these dynamic experiences that they typically struggle to make something feel special or unique. Now, what he's talking about that changes it is that they are going to have the loot be something that changes in what is available and what is not available. MMOs do this a lot through seasonal events where they put these things in game. We just came out of a lot of games Halloween event, and if those Halloween events drop relevant level gear or like an inventory bag like they do in Guild Wars, then all of a sudden you don't have a chance to get that thing till it comes around next year. And sometimes those events, those items can continue to be used. Maybe it's used to make a particular food that you can consume during a raid that makes that food very good to have. And that means all of a sudden that food skyrockets in price as the materials to make that food dwindle out of supply. And so putting that in as a regular mechanic that is in year round is interesting. Gathering is something that I think the current spate of large MMOs don't take advantage of. It's very frustrating in Final Fantasy that the world of Eorzea has this deep, profound lore through the main scenario quest, and yet you cannot expound on that lore. You cannot make it bigger and meatier by making the gathering meaningful. There is a story to be told. If there is an olive tree that only grows in one area because it was originally bred and maintained by these local druids, and then there is a big one of those olive trees inside a courtyard in a castle, then all of a sudden you say, well, how did that get there? It drops the same olives. And you go, well, those druids actually way back were rescued from a large battle by the king of that castle, and as a tribute they gave him the most magical of their olive trees, and so that one actually drops more olives. All of a sudden, that is something that's constantly ingrained into your brain every time you harvest it, and you know that story. So you have a chance for gathering to help tell that story. If something only grows in an area after it's rained, and you notice that in one particular zone it grows a lot more, that tells you that it rains there more. And so World of Warcraft just basically puts these nodes all over, but there's a chance to tell me something. If there is a particular flower that only grows where blood was spilt, then there is a chance for that flower to tell me of battles of the game's history. And it is something that games leave on the table a lot as a way of helping tell the story, but not so literally. It's not told through quest text. It's not told through voice dialogue. It's told because it's a real place. It's treated like a real world. You can feel the history. You can feel it through the architecture. You can feel it through the nature in the area. You can feel it through the behavior of the people that are there. So if it can do that, that is something that MMORPGs have typically struggled with. And they struggle with it because they typically are too busy either trying to release content on time or too busy balancing the way that players take advantage of things to be able to leave like things like that that would maybe show up in a single player RPG in place. A single player RPG can tell these stories because ultimately if that king's olive tree becomes really broken and it becomes too good of a source of olives, who cares? But in MMO, lots of people care. And so you have to fix it.
Discuss Ultima Online's approach to it and conclude with Ashes of Creation's solutions. So Ultima Online is obviously an MMORPG that should be revered for the way it tried to innovate and carve a path for this genre we love so dearly. The devs behind this MMO are extremely talented and passionate, and by the end of this segment, I think you'll understand why. Additionally, I'm pretty sure there's a few developers within Intrepid who worked on Ultima Online, however that's a huge citation needed, so feel free to let us know down in the comments below. Surely Steven wouldn't attempt such a thing without the guidance of the devs who originally attempted it, right? Ultima Online's virtual ecology began as an automated system to bridge the gap between developers making content and players consuming it, which I thought was really interesting because this still feels like a problem MMORPGs face today. What was really interesting about this tech used back in the 1990s was that the grass had stages that would change as herbivores consumed the vegetation, and should an area run out of food for these herbivore class of animals, they were programmed to go elsewhere and find more, which would evidently lead them into carnivore territory and ultimately have them end up as food for said carnivores.
I love when games have like a wolf get hungry and attack a rabbit. The question then is, if there are not enough rabbits for the wolves to eat, if I just go into an area and systematically snipe all the rabbits, will the wolves starve to death? How far are you willing to take this simulation? If something pushes out of an area, if we chop all the trees in an area down, do the birds die? And if the birds die, do the things that eat the birds die? How many stages are you willing to follow this down that road, keeping in mind that then you would need to make quests that respond to that? Maybe a farmer in an area really doesn't like that wolves came in and killed all his cows. Why did they kill all his cows? Because we killed all those rabbits. And so they got hungry and were willing to risk taking on larger prey inside more dangerous areas for them because their food source had been removed. And yet, I want to do that quest because I need it for an achievement, or I want the loot, or I just want to do quests I've never done before, and it's not up right now because the wolves are not a threat to the farmer at this exact moment. So how much of that are you willing to do, knowing that every quest you design that is not available is effectively, in that given moment, not content? Perception is reality. So if you have a game where a particular farmer has 25 possible quests, depending on season and the various factors in their area, but I show up and they have no quests available because none of their criteria are met, then I simply move on and go, man, that's a bummer. There should really be a quest here. This seems like a cool farm. And if that is true of too many nodes in a row, node being their word, then what happens if I start to feel like, well, I went out to the nodes today, I did my 3 quests, and I guess there's nothing else to do? Meanwhile, the devs took the time to painstakingly put 150 quests in the area, which means they used real dev resources, real time, on real computers, with real assets, real quality assurance, and yet I, as the player, did not receive it.
Game back in the late 1990s, this is an incredible feat of engineering. Truly goes to show just how ahead of the curve the Ultima Online devs were when it comes to innovating and creating solutions to problems before they even arise. But just as all things that do try to innovate, they tend to be at the mercy of the unknown. They took into account plants acting like plants, herbivores acting like herbivores, and carnivores acting like carnivores, but failed to account for humans acting like humans. You know, the sweaty, no-life neckbeards who have absolutely nothing better to do than grind endlessly in a virtual world to prove they are not worthless stains on society. Actually, forget that I'd made this joke. The problem obviously ended up being the lack of understanding when it comes to player mentality back in the 1990s. Herbivores' loot and assets were designed to have next to no value, and this, on paper, meant that they were a non-appealing target for players. However, as you can probably guess, this didn't work on many levels. First of all, the swarm of players all entering the world at once completely overwhelmed the population of creatures, meaning anything and everything was a meaningful target, as things simply could not respawn fast enough no matter how much the devs tweaked the numbers. Players ended up killing anything on sight the moment it spawned, even the herbivores. The decision to give their pelts very little value and have 0 quests to actually kill them ended up being completely irrelevant for multiple unforeseen reasons.
This is why in New World you have to have trees respawn. Because you have to imagine on a fresh start server, when you have an event where people are supposed to chop down 6,200 young trees and then chop down 25,000 mature trees, if mature trees grew out of young trees and young trees grew over time, it is possible for 500 players to sweep through a zone and that zone be a barren wasteland for a while. Which means then you need to design events to take place in the barren wasteland that need to be addressed. And if they're not addressed, you need to create a way for the zone to naturally push itself through those states, because at that point you have to question, maybe players don't enjoy doing the barren wasteland progression items, and so maybe the game needs to naturally move itself back into that lush forest state. So at that point, do the NPCs also cause the events to take place if we don't step in? Is this something where if we don't take an action, the world will eventually move itself through random unforeseen states? Because if not, what happens if something just sits stale? So it starts to create a huge issue with the amount of content you have to generate. It is much easier to have a hunter sit there and tell you to hunt 10 bears, and when those 10 bears die, you just make more bears.
First of all, herbivores were a far less of a combat threat to players, meaning you weren't so likely to die to Ultima Online's unforgiving combat. And secondly, the pelts were still used by players to craft gear, fueling the economy side of the game, so even though the in-game value was low, they still held significant value to the players themselves, likely showing the first ever signs of how player economy works in an MMORPG. You can even use this mentality today, as New World is a great example of player mentality and poorly designed economy, because we witnessed a pretty hard economy crash at the launch of the game 1 year ago and again during the fresh start last week. Ultimately, you simply cannot outpace the autistic players without significant experience, knowledge, and planning. 3 resources not available to the devs back in the 1990s. However, that didn't stop them from trying. Multiple attempts to fix it was had, starting with something known as shards, a system used across many MMOs nowadays. Some of you may know this as worlds in RuneScape, channels in Black Desert Online, servers for World of Warcraft, and realms for Final Fantasy XIV. It is basically multiple instances of the same world, just with a maximum player cap. In the end, there was no solution to this problem, and this innovative, genius ecology system was completely removed from Ultima Online, and the players never even knew it existed. However, all is not lost. Although they could not find a solution after months of trying, they came away with a lesson, and a lesson I hope Ashes of Creation has taken great heed to. So let's conclude today's video with this lesson, because I think it answers one of the most frequently asked concerns for this highly anticipated MMORPG, and I hope you guys will send them this video when you see them express it. The public testing environment. So testing a game in-house obviously doesn't compare to testing with players. This is a statement taken straight from the mouth of Ultima Online's creative director, and likely one of the main reasons Steven chose to take on this challenge. You see, Ashes of Creation is in a position no other MMORPG has been in before. Almost all of its systems and mechanics are going to be tested publicly and iterated upon to make sure they work and feel great. Kind of like World of Warcraft's PTRs.
World of Warcraft PTRs used to be a lot more useful. At this point, it feels like they leave them in place because they've always been in place and they don't want to take them away. But they release them so, like, the releases are so close to when it hits the PTR that it feels like they don't even have time to iterate on the feedback, nor do they want to. The problem with a PTR, if you assume that player feedback is good, is A, you don't get diverse people on a PTR. You get hardcore people on a PTR. You know, people just trying out the game. So you don't get a representative of the entire population. But let's say you account for that. Let's say you have some math for that, and you're like, yeah, I got it. People also just play differently on a PTR. I'm on the Fresh Start event server for New World right now, and I don't care about anything long-lasting because after the 18th, I'm going to go back to my main character. All I care about is my ability to contribute to the event. And so I am willing to have behavior that is not my normal behavior. And PTRs encourage that because a lot of times you can just keep copying your character over, or you keep getting Delta-based set of gear. You have no skin in the game. You have no risk. So it doesn't matter. So I think PTRs are good, but they aren't perfect. Final Fantasy XIV doesn't do PTRs, but as a result, you could also argue Final Fantasy XIV doesn't really have any of these dynamic systems that would require a PTR.
Oh, wait, no, never mind. That's not a good example. This will make a massive difference to the end result because players simply don't think the same way that the devs do. Players tend to deliberately go out of their way to exploit things and find the path of least resistance, and by God, if there's something today's age of players has shown us, is that they are willing to bend over backwards to try and cheat their way to consuming the game for as least amount of effort as possible. I'm positive the Alpha 2 is going to be a complete shitstorm at the launch because of this, and that's perfectly okay. That's exactly what it exists for, and our community...
So what about this is something that's never been done before? Like, what about this is a unique position if we're just admitting that it's going to be a complete crapstorm?
At the launch because of this, and that's perfectly okay. That's exactly what it exists for, and our community are passionate enough to break as much shit as possible to ensure that it does get fixed. The amount of communication we have with Intrepid themselves is also a massive difference to our currently popular MMOs. Not many developers, let alone millionaire creative directors, end up in the YouTube comment sections, forums, and Reddit posts to help spread the correct information about their game, simply because there's usually a corporate layer of public relations stopping them, or, more likely, they simply don't care. Well, Steven Sharif has shown...
Those are the only two options? That there's a corporate veil they can't pierce, or they don't care? Naoki Yoshida interacts with this community directly or indirectly roughly 100 times a year. Directly. Meaningfully. Not to mention his other team members have taken tons and tons of interactions as well. That means that across the time that Final Fantasy XIV has been under his direction, he has likely interacted with the community a minimum of 1,000 times. And he is busy maintaining existing content while coming out with upcoming content across multiple games as a director at a corporate company, as opposed to Steven is spending his own money at his own pace on a game that he does not have to worry about things like, hey, the servers went down today, because it doesn't exist. So to say this doesn't happen, I think is fair, but to say that it doesn't happen because people don't care, like that's the only other option. Because there's a corporate culture they can't come out past, or they don't care, I think is ridiculous. I have friends that work at gaming companies. I don't know why you would work in the gaming company if you truly don't care. I see how they give the impression of not caring. I see how there are rare examples of those people who come out and say they don't care. But to say it that blanket statement that they're either in prison of some corporate structure or they don't care, and those are the only two possible outcomes, is wildly oversimplifying it. And then to say Steven is this mythical hero that can do these things because he cares, when he is just in a different position. He is not in charge of a game that exists. It does not exist.
That he does care, and that is why I stand behind. Well, Steven Sharif has shown that he does care, and that is why I stand behind this project. I believe he truly wants to bring these systems to life, and without our testing and feedback, it will never come to life. But it comes at a price, you see, a price that I think is something we all need to deal with, and that's going to be the ultimate YouTube guides for the game, min-maxing the fun out of it before the beta phases even arrive. Can this be stopped? Possibly. However, this is a whole video in itself, and a video I have already made, so go check that out because my channel has taken a nosedive since the normies found out that this game has PvP in it. Now, speaking of shilling for other videos, in the previous one, I teased the survey system, and this is an integral part of the ecology system Ashes of Creation is trying to implement here. Resources have a fixed rate at which they regrow, but depending on the land score, as Steven put it, it affects the spawn rate of these materials. The size affected by these changes in the world could be as large as the whole world, down to just one specific biome, down even further to just one specific node, or go even as small as just your freehold. But the most interesting part about it is that players affect this land score in a positive or negative way through various activities. These are teased to be things as simple as rotating your crops, removing poachers who have spawned in their dynamic event system, and even something as small as a request set up by the local mayor to remove a specific type of invasive plant that is stunting the growth of local flora. Additionally, the negative effects on your region land score impacts the social side of the game in ways no other MMO does currently, further fueling that economic and competitive push and pull dynamic by over-farming materials from another biome and protecting the materials within your own. For example, hunting predators within your own region will affect your land score in a negative way, so traveling out further to hunt the region next doors instead opens you up to that risk versus reward gameplay that Ashes of Creation is trying to push. They've teased a plethora of...
So the first thing is people will absolutely optimize this. For the purpose, like people will absolutely optimize. They will know exactly how much land score everything grants, and they will optimize this unbelievably fast. World of Warcraft had a problem. There was an idea that an individual player could not have fun in a zone because other people were tagging monsters. In Vanilla WoW, if I went to kill the big bad Narc, the Minotaur, then as soon as I fought him, you needed to wait until I finished fighting him for him to die and then respawn, or for him to kill me, and then it was your turn. So they decided, you know what? If we party up, maybe we could share credit. Sure. And so there was a communal idea that you would party up for these various things, even if you were mid-poll. If somebody asked to be invited, there was a communal solution to this. But that's not perfect. So what they did is they created a shared tag system. And what that means is that if you attack it, you're now getting credit as well. But obviously, there's a problem with that, because now who gets the loot? If we were in a group, it should really take the loot, and it should either split that loot in half, or it should give the loot to me this time, and you the next time, or something like that, because otherwise, now all of a sudden, it's generating more loot, and we killed it faster because there's two of us. So it became a little bit hard on how to balance shared tags. And so as this system evolved through various expansions and things like that, as we go into Dragonflight, tags can even be shared cross-faction, there became a problem with what do we do with the loot? And it has been solved a variety of ways by a variety of MMOs, but how do you deal with the rewards that drop off of a kill, whether that be experience or gold or items? Well, insert the personal loot system. This is something that we see in a number of MMORPGs, where effectively every time we kill it, then it is a relationship between me and the thing I killed on what loot I get, and it has nothing to do with you. And maybe it scales my loot based on the amount I contributed up to a cap. Maybe it just gives it to me, and if I come in and I just get one single hit, I get the maximum amount. But either way, there is a personal loot system that is going to feed that to me. The problem with a personal loot system is now, how do we make sure that it feels like I'm being rewarded appropriately? Well, it's very easy at that point. There's no real scarcity in a video game, technically. It can all be programmed to be infinite. So we can go ahead and, for example, say that this Minotaur is going to drop 10 gold. And every time I kill the Minotaur, it's going to drop 10 gold. If you help me, I don't want to be hurt just because you came in and tossed 1 or 2 hits on there. I shouldn't have to give up any of my gold, especially if you're being lazy about it. You don't even have the gear score that I do, and you're clearly not very good at the game. I want my 10 gold. Well, the solution to that friction between players is I still get my 10 gold. That way, by you helping, can't hurt. And because it can't hurt, that suddenly gets rid of that player animosity when it comes to things where we have a common goal. Maybe you don't want that in a game with perpetual PvP. Maybe you do want that animosity, but you get to make a choice on how to handle that. Well, the moment you make that choice, now players can optimize. Are we all fighting to share the 10 gold? In which case, I don't want to go anywhere that somebody else is fighting it, because now we're all splitting the pie, as opposed to me going somewhere else and getting my own pie. Well, you don't want to drive players away from being in interactions, so maybe everybody gets 10 gold. Well, now all of a sudden, this monster being killed solo is dropping 10 gold into the world, but a monster being killed by 8 players is dropping 80 gold into the world, which causes rampant inflation. Now we start to try to offset this by having various loot rules to determine how many people can share tags, how much credit there is, and in comes the World of Warcraft 4x2 farm. A 4x2 farm is an optimized format that basically took the rules that Blizzard tried to put into World of Warcraft to balance this loot system so it didn't drop too much gold, but it didn't drop not enough gold. And players optimize it to where now they can get tons and tons of loot per hour without getting so much loot per hour that the system begins to cap it. Begins to say, yeah, you're not getting loot on that one. That's too many people. They start to take advantage of things like force spawns. If you don't do force spawns, then what happens if somebody needs it for a quest and everything in the area is dead? So the moment you commit to any spawn system and any loot system, the moment there is anything to be gained and there is any method by which we can work out how the computer is determining when something is alive and what it will give me if I kill it, players will optimize it. They absolutely will. So we can talk about it like, well, because mature trees are worth 100 gold and young trees are worth 10 gold, people are going to all agree to, just like the real world, not chop down these trees till this date because there is a regulatory body. No. If I can get 10 gold and you get, or I can wait till later and some random person can get 100 gold, I'm going to take the 10 right now. Players will absolutely pull without somebody else unless there is a real incentive not to. Sometimes games can find enough of an incentive. Hunt mobs in Final Fantasy XIV have become a communal event because working together became the most optimal method. But the moment it's not, people are just going to steal tags. People are just going to be people.
Of interesting ways the system affects your land. Gameplay that Ashes of Creation is trying to push. They've teased a plethora of interesting ways the system affects your land score, but the three most interesting ones are the seasonal rotation that Vera will be subject to, the dynamic weather system they proudly showed off many months ago, but of course the most threatening of the bunch, the world bosses completely changing the region upon their arrival, giving the community a reason to want to go out and deal with them outside of just getting their sweet, sweet loot.
Okay, this is where I would bring up Forza Horizon 5. Forza Horizon 5, the race conditions are different when there is different weather, and the season that is available changes how you interact with the world and the events in it. There are certain things you need to do. It is played by a large number of people. It is played in a multiplayer environment, and it is an online game. And so the fact that there are narrative elements to it and there's a story to do, it has a weak connection to it, but you could in many ways consider it an MMORPG, though that would feel like you defined what MMORPG was, and Forza Horizon came in and said, we're one, and you're like, yeah, I guess, like, I didn't... Can we amend the rules? Because I didn't mean to let this guy in here. But ultimately, that's what they are. And they have seasonal and rain. And it does change the way you play. It does feel like when I log on and it's the wet season, I have a different set of objectives. And I look forward to the next particular event is up. This is something that's really nice. Rotational things like the Dark Moon Fair in World of Warcraft, or the various seasonal events that many MMORPGs have, or what happens when a particular faction owns a zone in New World, start to feel really meaningful because it means that there are things I look forward to one day doing. There are things that I look forward to where I am going to eventually get to do this thing. I have it on my to-do list, and I will only do it once the following things come together. There are sightseeing logs within within Final Fantasy XIV's original base game, A Realm Reborn, their 2.0, that are only completable during certain times of day and certain weather conditions. However, as soon as you move beyond that, while weather does remain persistent in things like cutscenes, it no longer has the exact value that it did. Sometimes in games, things like fishing are the exception to this, where they can only be fished during certain times of day, certain weather, and on top of this, I guess you could say seasons. But effectively what it means is a player can look out and say, this will be available next Thursday evening. So next Thursday, when it gets here, I'm going to do this. So fishing is generally the exception to this rule, but the vast majority of combat systems no longer rely on this. And when they do, it's usually in a very succinct way, a very localized thing. Final Fantasy XIV, in their expansion Stormblood, added a zone called Eureka. This was what was called an exploratory zone, where everything worked just a little bit differently. And the metric by which we summoned effectively world bosses to fight was through actions the players did. Players did eventually optimize this into what they called trains, and they ran around in specific orders and did specific things to summon bosses for the optimal outcome for all involved. But when it first came in, it felt immense. It felt like we truly had control over this world. But the moment you realize that players could control the equivalent of seasons and weather and what bosses were up, people did that. World events in Guild Wars feel like they drastically change the world the first time you see the world event. They come in, maybe they knock a bunch of trees over, and it's a big area with poison ponds and stuff, and you're running around the poison ponds, and the moment the event ends, it returns to its natural state. Quickly, slowly, doesn't really matter, but effectively if you show up an hour later or 2 hours later, it's what it was, like the world boss was never there in the first place. But the moment you have been to that meta event 2 times, 5 times, 10 times, you're still waiting to get that freaking component you need to craft a sword or whatever from it, it loses that newness. So I think it's interesting how many layers they're putting on this, because each layer will make everything below it feel just a little bit more random, but it's not random, right? If the game didn't have seasons, then you would have the same outcome all the time, but now it's theoretically, let's say 4 seasons, 4 outcomes. It's a mythical world. It could have as many seasons or as few seasons as it wants. And they can rotate based on a timer, or they can be player driven, or they can be done off lunar cycles, and the eclipse can cause something, and they can change, like Guild Wars PvP seasons, where based on the size of PvP determines the length of season. Who knows? It can be whatever rules they want, but effectively we have a static number of seasons that are changing at a pre-predicted rate, and you can basically say, at this day, on this time, if I log in, it will be this season. Or if it's player driven, these are the actions I can take to change that. Final Fantasy has weather, and you can talk to different NPCs to see what the weather is in different parts of the world. The question is, what are you doing with that? There are timed gathering nodes and things like that, and that causes those to feel incredibly rare. But ultimately, something is controlling it. So I appreciate how dynamic they're trying to make it feel. But when he says maybe players will, maybe players won't be able to create these optimized guides, I'm telling you they will. They will. Because ultimately, it is a finite number of possibilities. And it doesn't matter whether this area always has the Elder Dragon of the Wood, or this has any number of 100 bosses. Somebody will make a video that will say, here in the land between the mountain and the tree, here are the 100 things you need to look out for, or here's the one thing you need to look out for. Here's why it's important. Here's what you can get from this zone. Here are where the Elder Dragons spawn and the criteria by which they spawn. Here are the areas where whatever. Somebody will make a guide. If there is any reason to do this, any reason players want it, then somebody will make a video for it, because it's fun to make videos that people want to watch.
Vera is aiming to be a true, living, breathing world, and although many MMOs have attempted such systems like Guild Wars 2's dynamic events, but nothing quite compares to what Intrepid are attempting, and as we discussed before, it's the public testing element that Ashes of Creation has over these games, and that's why I believe it will succeed where all previous attempts have failed. But
what's the MMO where we run around in mechanical suits that died? They had a ton of public testing. Public testing on its own doesn't guarantee you success. It's a great step. It's a great form of quality assurance, and ultimately what it means is that you get a lot more feedback very rapidly. It ultimately doesn't actually mean that you, like, there are people that say, well, they just do that because they don't want to staff up QA, but all those bug reports we file, all that data that comes in from those people, that has to be analyzed by somebody. So there's still a QA department involved. You're just not picturing a bunch of people sitting around playing the game. You're picturing a bunch of people reading reports and reading data about it. And so, like, didn't Anthem have a ton of public stuff? Didn't Star Citizen, haven't they done some stuff? So, like, Anthem's not a success story, and yet they tried to have a ton of communication. They tried to promise a bunch of crazy things. They had a bunch of hype. They had some cool looking gameplay. They had public stuff, but it ultimately didn't do well because of things that he's not talking about. When will it release? What will have in it when it releases? And how many resources will be intact to support it past those early pain points? New World had early pain points. It has survived it because Amazon keeps pumping cash into it. World of Warcraft had early pain points. It survived it because they had enough cash to make it through it, and even then it ultimately, the Activision merger helped them survive it. Final Fantasy XIV literally had to delete its initial 1.0, and we now begin in 2.0 because Square Enix pumped cash into it. These are not things that had anything to do with public testing. They didn't have to do with passion. They didn't have to do with how many YouTube comments did the dev leave. They survived it because they had the business resilience to do so.
Before we end today's video, allow me to pose a question for you, my dear viewer. Do you need a functioning, behind-the-scenes ecology system to work for you to truly enjoy an MMORPG? Personally, as nice as it is, just as the team behind Ultima Online said, at the end of the day, the players didn't even know it existed, so all the time and work they put into it never actually paid for itself, and even to this day goes unappreciated because to your average consumer, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. But as usual, I am just one nerd desperate for a good MMO, and my opinions mean nothing without you berating my knowledge of Ultima Online. And hey, as I genuinely have no Ultima Online experience, mainly because I'm not washed up and in my 50s, I'd actually be super interested to hear your experiences in Ultima Online and how it evolved over the years. The system as a whole seems nigh on impossible to pull off. However, I'm confident that Stephen and the team has what it takes to at least implement the essence of ecology, even if it is not a true, living, breathing world.
But Narc, do you think some wash-up indie team can innovate and create an actual world with meaning? What is the point? Because Pantheon has already done it.
And to that I say, listen kid, if you think a static world made from assets bought from a Unity store for $5 using a combat and crafting
Listen here, you little twerps. Pantheon may not have the same budget you intrepid cucks have, but I swear, even if it's the end of me, I will fund my game by any means necessary. And if you think that I won't, then you're high on copium.
Well, I think that what they're doing to make it feel dynamic is they're simply adding more variety. That means that is to be commended. It is to be commended. But it's not the be-all, end-all solution. And the reason other games do it is because it is easier to add more static quests and get your return on investment for the player to look out and see 100 quests available because they built 100 quests, than to put 100 quests across 10 nodes and the player to look out and realize there's only 10 ways to play. Guild Wars does try to fight this, and that's the example he named, and it would be my go-to example on something for this. But ultimately, there are a lot of people that don't know that about Guild Wars, so I'm not sure that really works out to their advantage sometimes. Is it required of an MMO? No, but your MMO does not have to have any one particular hook, but it does have to have a hook. So it doesn't have to be a working ecology, but if you're going to have something that makes you unique, maybe that working ecology is unique for them. I don't know. The reason other games don't do it is because players can ultimately break it, and players can ultimately feel disappointed by it. The amount of resources that go in it mean that there is less for them to do at any one time, and ultimately players will just steer it away from certain outcomes anyway. So unless you're just going to hard override them from time to time, there is a question of if players realize that it's never worth having winter be here, then they're always going to do all the events to push winter away, and then they're going to take as long as possible before winter comes back. And so if there's somebody out there that enjoys winter or needs winter for a particular reason, their play effectively ends up being taken away by the group meta. So there's a reason games don't do this. That doesn't mean don't do it, but you should definitely be aware of why everybody else avoided it. Sometimes if you look out and you feel like everybody maybe tried what you're doing, but nobody continued doing it, it's because you truly have a unique advantage. Sometimes people stop doing it, and you should ask yourself why. Because you might be walking down a road that is paved with the ashes of people who have all fallen before you. All right. Let's go play some New World. Oh. It keeps taking control of my keyboard. There we go. Oh. We'll see. I'm enjoying covering Ashes. I'm enjoying getting to know everything they're trying to take on. He's somebody that's been covering it for a while now, so I enjoy that he knows kind of some of these past statements and all that. The way when I talk about 14 and somebody newer to 14 comes in and goes, Yoshi P said they're against add-ons. What a change in what their stance is. And as somebody that's been covering it for a long time, I'm like, what are you talking about? They've said the same thing for years. Years. So, I think you have to ask yourself, why did Ultima Online drop this system and why did nobody else pick it up? It might be because they couldn't do what you can do. It also might be because it doesn't work. We'll find out. Hindsight's 2020. And on that note, guys, we're in a mid-roll right now. We have a minute and 10 seconds. I'm going to go take my minute and stretch, and I'll be back in like 60 seconds.